Welcome. Today, we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. In the late 1930s, the United States remained officially neutral while the rest of the world was sliding into war. The memory of World War I deeply influenced American society. More than 116,000 American servicemen had died in that earlier conflict, and many citizens believed involvement overseas had brought enormous losses with little reward. Isolationism dominated public opinion, and Congress passed neutrality acts meant to limit arms sales, loans, and direct involvement with nations at war. Most Americans believed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would shield the country from global conflict, and that European problems could be kept at a distance. While the United States stayed on the sidelines, international tensions escalated rapidly. In Europe, Nazi Germany pursued aggressive expansion. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the outbreak of World War II. Within months, Denmark and Norway fell, followed by the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. By the summer of 1940, France had surrendered, and Britain stood alone against Hitler's forces. German air raids battered British cities and ports, and the fear of a wider war grew. Across the Pacific, Imperial Japan waged a brutal war in China and expanded across Asia, taking territory and threatening regions controlled by Western powers. The conflict was widening, and the United States faced a reality that neutrality did not necessarily guarantee safety. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that American neutrality could not last indefinitely. Despite strong domestic opposition, he began preparing the nation for a potential war. Military spending increased, and in 1940 the United States adopted its first peacetime draft. In March 1941, Congress approved the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the United States to supply weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel to nations resisting the Axis powers. Britain depended heavily on this support, and after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, American aid also flowed to the USSR. Even before American troops entered combat, American factories were already producing for war, and American ships carried supplies across dangerous seas where submarines hunted. The United States was not yet firing the first shot on land, but it was steadily becoming the industrial backbone of the Allied side. Relations between the United States and Japan deteriorated throughout 1941. Japan relied heavily on imported oil and raw materials, much of which came from the United States. As Japan continued expanding in Asia, Washington responded with economic sanctions. Japanese assets were frozen, and oil exports were cut off. For Japan's military leadership, this was a critical threat. Without oil, Japan's Navy and Air Force could not operate. Japanese leaders concluded war with the United States was unavoidable and planned a decisive first strike intended to cripple American power in the Pacific, long enough for Japan to secure resources and fortify its new conquests. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Battleships were struck at anchor, airfields were bombed, and many aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were killed and over 1,000 wounded. The attack stunned the nation. isolationist arguments collapsed overnight. A war that had seemed distant suddenly felt immediate and personal, and the demand for a response unified the country in a way the political debates of the previous years never had. On December 8th, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan with overwhelming support. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and America was now committed to a two-front global conflict. The country had to fight in the Pacific while also confronting the main power of Nazi Germany in Europe. American strategy quickly formed around close cooperation with Britain, and leaders agreed that Germany would be the priority, even as fierce battles loomed against Japan. At the moment of entry, the United States was not fully prepared for a war of this scale. The U.S. Army was relatively small, training was uneven, and much equipment was outdated. Combat experience was limited. Yet the United States possessed unmatched industrial capacity and the ability to mobilize fast. Factories converted from civilian output to military production. Automobile plants produced tanks and trucks, shipyards launched warships at record speed, and aircraft factories delivered thousands of planes. Millions of Americans were drafted or volunteered, and training camps spread across the country, turning civilians into soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. By the end of 1941, America had committed itself to total war, still early in its learning curve, and unaware of how costly the coming years would be. After entering the war in December 1941, American leaders faced a difficult reality. The United States was mobilizing at unprecedented speed, but its army lacked modern combat experience. Sending untested troops directly against the main German forces in Western Europe was considered too risky. Instead, Allied planners chose North Africa as the place where American soldiers would face the enemy for the first time. This decision led to Operation Torch, the first major U.S. ground offensive against Axis forces. On November 8, 1942, American and British troops landed along the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, territories controlled by Vichy France, a regime aligned with Nazi Germany. For many American soldiers, these landings marked their first experience of war. The operations were chaotic. Coordination between land, sea, and air forces was imperfect, and communication problems were common. In some areas, American troops faced unexpected resistance from French forces before ceasefires were negotiated. Despite confusion and losses, the Allies secured key ports and airfields within days. Soon after the landings, American forces encountered a far more dangerous opponent, the German Afrika Korps, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. German troops were battle-hardened veterans, highly disciplined and experienced after years of fighting across Europe and North Africa. In contrast, many American units were poorly led, inadequately trained, and unfamiliar with desert warfare. These weaknesses were brutally exposed in early 1943. In February 1943, American forces clashed with German units at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result was a severe defeat. German armor smashed through American lines, exploiting poor coordination and inexperienced leadership. U.S. units retreated in disarray, suffering heavy casualties and equipment losses. The battle shocked American commanders and shattered any illusions that industrial power alone could win battles. The U.S. Army had entered the war, but it was clear that it still had much to learn. The defeat at Kasserine Pass became a turning point. American leadership underwent rapid changes. Commanders who proved ineffective were replaced, training intensified, and doctrine improved. General George S. Patton was brought in to restore discipline and confidence. Under stricter leadership, American units improved their coordination, battlefield communication, and combined arms tactics. Soldiers learned hard lessons about camouflage, movement, logistics, and the deadly effectiveness of German defenses. As spring 1943 approached, American forces fought alongside British units to push Axis troops out of Tunisia. The fighting was intense and costly, but American performance steadily improved. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa were completely defeated. More than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, marking one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. North Africa was secured, and the Mediterranean sea lanes were opened for Allied operations. For the United States Army, the North African campaign was more than a victory. It was a brutal education. American troops entered the war inexperienced and overconfident, but they emerged tougher, more disciplined, and far better prepared for what lay ahead. The cost had been high, but the lessons learned would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. The U.S. Army was no longer untested. It had taken its first blows, adapted, and survived. After the victory in North Africa in May 1943, Allied leaders faced a critical strategic decision. A direct invasion of France was still considered too risky, as German defenses along the Atlantic coast were strong and Allied forces needed more experience. Instead, the Allies turned toward southern Europe. Italy was viewed as the weakest Axis partner, and its removal from the war was expected to weaken Germany and force it to divert troops from other fronts. For American soldiers, Italy would become one of the most exhausting and punishing campaigns of the war. The campaign began with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. American and British forces landed on the island in one of the largest amphibious operations up to that point. While the landings were successful, the fighting inland was far from easy. German forces conducted disciplined rearguard actions, using the rugged terrain to delay Allied advances. Despite this resistance, Sicily fell within weeks. The invasion had a major political impact. In July 1943, Benito Mussolini was removed from power, and the Italian government began secret negotiations with the Allies. In September 1943, Italy officially surrendered. However, the war in Italy was far from over. German forces quickly moved to occupy the country, disarming Italian units and establishing strong defensive positions. American troops soon discovered that the surrender of Italy did not mean an easy victory. Instead, they faced experienced German divisions determined to hold every mile of ground. The Italian terrain favored the defender. Mountains, narrow roads, rivers, and poor weather turned every advance into a slow and bloody struggle. American forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, facing fierce German counterattacks. For several days, the beachhead was in serious danger of being pushed back into the sea. Only heavy naval gunfire and relentless air support prevented disaster. The fighting at Salerno demonstrated that German troops in Italy were highly capable and that victory would not come quickly. As Allied forces pushed north, progress slowed to a crawl. One of the most infamous battles of the Italian campaign centered on Monte Cassino. The Germans had constructed a powerful defensive line across central Italy, known as the Gustav Line. At its center stood the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, overlooking key roads to Rome. From late 1943 into 1944, American and Allied forces launched repeated assaults against this position. The fighting was brutal. Attacks across rivers, muddy valleys, and steep slopes resulted in heavy casualties. Despite intense bombing and multiple ground assaults, German defenders held their positions for months. In January 1944, the Allies attempted to break the stalemate with an amphibious landing at Anzio, behind German lines. The goal was to force a rapid advance toward Rome and collapse German defenses. Instead, hesitation and strong German counterattacks trapped Allied forces in a vulnerable beachhead. American soldiers endured constant artillery fire, air attacks, and shortages, while pinned down near the coast. The Anzio operation became a symbol of missed opportunity and prolonged suffering. Only in the spring of 1944 did the situation begin to change. After renewed offensives, Allied forces finally broke through the German defenses at Monte Cassino. The Anzio beachhead was linked with advancing ground forces, and the German line collapsed. In June 1944, American troops entered Rome, marking the first Axis capital to fall. The victory came at a high cost. The Italian campaign had proven to be slow, exhausting, and deadly, forcing American soldiers to fight not only the enemy, but also the terrain, weather, and constant attrition. Italy became a grinding war of endurance, shaping American forces for the even greater battles that still lay ahead. By 1944, the Allied leadership understood that victory in Europe required a direct assault on Nazi-occupied Western Europe. Years of planning, deception, and preparation led to Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. For American forces, this operation would become the defining moment of the war in Europe. The beaches of Normandy were heavily fortified, defended by experienced German units, and protected by concrete bunkers, artillery, minefields, and obstacles designed to tear landing craft apart before soldiers even reached the shore. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied aircraft crossed the English Channel. American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines in darkness and confusion. Many units landed far from their intended drop zones due to heavy anti-aircraft fire and poor visibility. Small groups of American paratroopers fought isolated battles throughout the night, cutting communication lines, destroying bridges, and attacking German strongpoints. Despite heavy casualties and disorganization, their actions created chaos among German defenders and weakened resistance on the beaches. At dawn, American forces assaulted two primary landing zones, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. At Utah Beach, landings went relatively well. Strong leadership, lighter resistance, and fortunate navigation errors placed American troops in a less defended area. Casualties were relatively low, and American forces moved inland quickly. Omaha Beach was a different story entirely. German defenses there were intact, elevated, and deadly. American troops landing at Omaha faced intense machine gun fire, artillery, and mortar attacks the moment ramps dropped. Many soldiers were killed before they could leave their landing craft. Chaos dominated Omaha Beach. Units were shattered, officers were killed, and command structures collapsed. Survivors huddled behind obstacles or lay pinned down on open sand. Despite the carnage, small groups of American soldiers began pushing forward. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers took control, organizing assaults on German bunkers. Using grenades, explosives, and sheer determination, these men climbed the bluffs under fire and broke through enemy defenses. By afternoon, American troops had secured footholds atop the cliffs. Omaha Beach, though soaked in blood, had not been lost. By the end of D-Day, more than 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. American casualties were severe, particularly at Omaha, but the invasion succeeded. The Germans had failed to push the Allies back into the sea. However, victory on the beaches was only the beginning. The terrain beyond Normandy proved difficult. Hedgerows, narrow lanes, and small villages favored the defender. German forces regrouped and fought stubbornly, turning every field into a battlefield. Throughout June and July 1944, American troops fought brutal close-range battles through the Norman countryside. Progress was slow and costly. Tanks struggled to maneuver, infantry faced ambushes at close range, and casualties mounted. American forces adapted, modifying tactics and equipment to deal with the hedgerow terrain. Gradually, pressure built against German lines. In late July 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout offensive supported by overwhelming air power. German defenses collapsed under the assault. Once free of the hedgerows, American armored units advanced rapidly across France. German forces retreated in disorder, suffering heavy losses. By August, Paris was liberated, and the Allied advance toward Germany was underway. The invasion of Normandy had succeeded, opening a second front in Europe and marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in the West. The Battle of the Bulge. America faces Germany's last gamble. By the end of 1944, American forces had advanced deep into Western Europe. France had been liberated, and Allied troops stood along Germany's western borders. Many American soldiers believed the war was nearing its end. German forces appeared exhausted, short on fuel, and steadily retreating. Allied commanders expected continued progress toward the Rhine. What they did not expect was one final, massive German counteroffensive. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a desperate gamble intended to change the course of the war. The plan was to strike through the Ardennes forest, a region considered unsuitable for large-scale attacks due to its dense woods and poor roads. Hitler believed this area was lightly defended by inexperienced American units. His goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was Germany's last major offensive of the war. On December 16, 1944, German forces attacked under the cover of heavy fog and poor weather. American units were caught by surprise. German tanks and infantry punched through thin American lines, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. Communications broke down, roads became jammed with retreating units, and confusion spread rapidly. In the opening days, several American regiments were surrounded or overrun. Entire units were forced to withdraw under intense pressure. The winter conditions made the battle even more brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow covered the forests and roads. American soldiers often lacked adequate winter clothing and shelter. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Despite these conditions, American troops resisted fiercely. Small units held road junctions and villages, slowing the German advance and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. One of the most critical points of the battle was the town of Bastogne, a key road hub in Belgium. German forces surrounded the town, trapping American defenders, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division. Cut off from supplies and surrounded by enemy forces, the Americans refused to surrender. When German commanders demanded their surrender, the American response was a single word: nuts. The defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American determination. As the weather improved, Allied air power returned to the battlefield. American aircraft struck German supply lines, destroying fuel depots and vehicles. German forces, already short on fuel and ammunition, began to slow. American reinforcements, including armored units under General George S. Patton, counterattacked. Fighting was intense and costly, with villages changing hands multiple times. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. The Bulge was eliminated, and German losses were devastating. Thousands of experienced soldiers, tanks, and aircraft were destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army during World War II. American casualties exceeded 70,000, including killed, wounded, and missing. The battle shattered any remaining hope Germany had of stopping the Allied advance in the West. For American soldiers, it was a defining moment. They had faced surprise, extreme weather, and determined enemy forces, yet they held their ground and prevailed. After the Ardennes, the road to Germany lay open. The final collapse of Nazi resistance was now only a matter of time. The Pacific War, island by island toward Japan. While American forces fought across Europe, a very different war raged across the Pacific Ocean. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States faced an enemy unlike any it had encountered before. Imperial Japan controlled vast areas of the Pacific, fortified islands, and defended its territory with fierce determination. The Pacific War became a brutal struggle defined by long distances, naval power, air superiority, and savage ground combat on remote islands. The first major American offensive against Japan began in August 1942 with the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The objective was to stop Japanese expansion and protect vital supply routes to Australia. American Marines landed on the island and quickly captured a partially completed Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field. What followed was 6 months of relentless fighting. Japanese forces launched repeated ground assaults, naval battles raged offshore, and air combat dominated the skies. Conditions were horrific. Tropical heat, disease, hunger, and exhaustion plagued both sides. By February 1943, Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal. It was the first major land defeat suffered by Japan and marked a turning point in the Pacific War. After Guadalcanal, the United States adopted a strategy known as island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held position, American forces targeted key islands, bypassing others and cutting them off from supply. This approach allowed the United States to move steadily closer to Japan while reducing casualties. American naval and air power expanded rapidly, giving the United States increasing control of the Pacific. In February 1945, American forces launched one of the most famous and brutal battles of the war, the invasion of Iwo Jima. This small volcanic island was critical for air operations against Japan. Japanese defenders, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, constructed an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and underground positions. Unlike earlier battles, Japanese forces did not attempt mass banzai charges. Instead, they fought a disciplined defense, inflicting maximum casualties. American Marines faced intense resistance. Every yard of ground was contested. The black volcanic sand made movement difficult, and artillery fire came from hidden positions. The battle lasted over a month. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and more than 19,000 were wounded. Almost all of the Japanese defenders were killed. The famous image of American Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became one of the most iconic symbols of the war, but it did not mark the end of the fighting. Iwo Jima demonstrated how costly an invasion of Japan itself might be. The final and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War followed soon after. In April 1945, American forces invaded Okinawa, the largest island in the Ryukyu chain. Okinawa was considered the final stepping stone before a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands. Japanese defenders prepared for a prolonged battle of attrition. They used caves, tunnels, and fortified ridgelines to slow the American advance. The fighting was brutal and prolonged. Okinawa also saw massive kamikaze attacks against the U.S. Navy. Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships, causing devastating damage and heavy casualties. The psychological impact was enormous. On land, American troops faced relentless resistance, heavy rain, mud, and constant artillery fire. Civilians were caught in the fighting, adding to the human tragedy. By June 1945, Okinawa fell, but at an immense cost. Over 12,000 Americans were killed, and tens of thousands were wounded. Japanese military losses were catastrophic, and civilian casualties were enormous. The battle convinced many American leaders that an invasion of Japan would result in unimaginable losses on both sides. The Pacific War had become a brutal contest of endurance, and the end was approaching. But the price of victory was terrifyingly clear. Final conclusion: the price of victory and the legacy of American forces in World War II. By the summer of 1945, the war that had begun years earlier with distant battles and political hesitation was finally over. For the United States, World War II had become the largest and most demanding conflict in its history. American forces had fought across continents and oceans, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, from frozen forests in Europe to volcanic islands thousands of miles from home. The scale of the effort was unprecedented, and so was the cost. More than 16 million Americans served in uniform during the war. Over 400,000 never returned. These losses were not abstract numbers. They were sons, brothers, fathers, and friends. Entire communities were shaped by absence and sacrifice. American soldiers endured combat, disease, exhaustion, and fear in environments they could never have imagined before the war. Many returned home forever changed by what they had seen and experienced. The war transformed the United States itself. What had entered the conflict as a nation divided by isolationist debate emerged as a global superpower. American industry proved decisive, producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons on a scale unmatched in history. Military coordination between land, sea, and air forces matured rapidly through hard-earned experience. Mistakes were paid for in blood, but lessons were learned. By the end of the war, American forces had become among the most experienced and effective fighting forces in the world. Yet victory came with moral weight. American troops witnessed the full consequences of total war, including the liberation of concentration camps and the devastation of civilian populations. In the Pacific, battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the extreme cost of fighting an enemy unwilling to surrender. These experiences influenced the decisions that brought the war to its final, controversial conclusion with the use of atomic weapons against Japan. The war ended, but the questions it raised would echo for generations. World War II reshaped global politics, military strategy, and international relations. The United States emerged not only as a military victor, but as a nation bearing responsibility for shaping the post-war world. Institutions, alliances, and security structures formed in the aftermath of the war would define global affairs for decades. The American role in that world was forged on battlefields far from home, by ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances. Today, the legacy of American involvement in World War II remains deeply ingrained in national memory. It is remembered not only for victory, but for sacrifice, endurance, and the cost of freedom. The stories of those who fought serve as a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders and strategies, but by the actions of individuals who carried the burden of war. Their experience stands as a testament to the reality of conflict and the price paid to bring it to an end. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.